Hello Starlight, welcome back to my channel, Sparkles. Today we're diving into year 5 of the Enchanted Ones, and everything is about to change. The Marauders are fractured after the events of last year, with James, Sirius, and Remus struggling to find their way back to one another while Hayley desperately tries to keep everyone together. At the same time, Hayley begins noticing worrying behavior from Barty Crouch Jr. and fears that something much darker is unfolding around Sofia. As if that wasn't enough, Hayley's secret Animagus form leads to a heart-stopping encounter in the Forbidden Forest, where an unexpected protector saves her from Moony during a full moon. Meanwhile, her mysterious magic continues to grow stronger, pulling her into strange visions that connect her to another era of Hogwarts and raising more questions than answers. Friendships are tested. Long-buried guilt finally comes to the surface. Iris refuses to let Hayley carry everything alone, and the shadows of an approaching war grow darker with every passing day. If you enjoy emotional friendships, Marauders-era drama, mystery, magical lore, and slow-burning character development, then I hope you'll enjoy this chapter. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's step back into Hogwarts for the beginning of year 5 of the Enchanted Ones. Blue Sparkles. Chapter 51. The silence between brothers time skip, outside of the Great Hall. Hayley arrives with Iris, as they're still best friends despite everything. Iris looks over to her. You're worried about them, aren't you? Hayley looks over to her, and she nods. Yeah, it's going to be the first time they're not fully talking to each other. Iris does a little nod, as Hayley's magic flicker, because of her emotions. Time skip, inside the Great Hall. The start of 5th year felt different. The air in the Great Hall was usually thick with the scent of roasted chicken and the joyous roar of 1,000 reunions. But for Hayley Potter, the atmosphere felt brittle, like parchment held too close to a candle. Hayley's gaze drifted immediately toward the Slytherin table. It was hard to miss Barty Crouch Jr. He was leaning over his sister, Sofia, his hand gripping the back of her chair with a possessiveness that made Hayley's skin crawl. Barty was speaking low and fast, his eyes darting around the room with a manic sort of brilliance. Sofia looked sick. She was staring at her empty gold plate, her shoulders hunched. Hayley knew that look. It was the look of someone being told a plan they couldn't stop and didn't want to join. Sofia glanced up, her eyes meeting Hayley's for a heartbeat, but a silent, desperate plea for a distraction before Barty jerked her chin back toward him, his expression darkening. As Hayley moved toward the Gryffindor table, the fractured state of the Marauders felt like a physical weight. James, her brother, was sitting several feet away from his usual spot. He was flanked by Jake and Rory, 2 third years. James was animated, gesturing about the Wronski feint, but his eyes kept flicking toward the middle of the table. He was performing. Hayley realized as he pretending he didn't notice the massive gap in his life. Sirius was further down the bench, his back to James. He was deep in a flirtatious conversation with Iris after she sat down next to him, his laughter echoing a bit too loudly against the rafters. Remus looked the worst of them all. He was tucked away with a thick tome, his face gaunt, and the scars on his cheeks looking particularly silver under the enchanted ceiling. As Hayley walked past, he looked up. He gave her a faint, weary smile, which is a silent hello, that carried the weight of the growing distance between him and her brother. Peter sat alone, hovering near Sirius but not quite part of the conversation, his eyes darting back and forth like he was waiting for someone to tell him where he was allowed to sit. Further up the table, Lily Evans was tucked between Marlene and Alice. They were a pocket of light in the gloom, Lily's red hair flashing as she laughed at something Marlene whispered. It was the only part of the table that felt like the Hogwarts Hayley remembered. Dumbledore rose, his robes shimmering like starlight, and with a flick of his hands, the feast appeared. The scent of roast beef and buttery corn filled the air, but Hayley's appetite was gone. Across the hall, she saw Barty Jr. laughing at something a group of older Slytherins said, while Sofia remained frozen, her fork barely moving. Hayley looked back at James. He was still talking to Jake, but his hand was shaking slightly as he reached for a goblet of pumpkin juice. The feast carried on, but for Hayley, the food tasted like ash. Something was shifting. The Slytherins were plotting, her brother was losing his anchors, and Sofia was trapped in the middle of a family shadow that looked a lot like a war. She reached into her pocket, fingering a small, smooth stone she'd kept there as a reminder of the secret training she'd been doing all summer. If the Marauders were falling apart, she would have to be the one to keep a watch on them, even if they didn't know she was there. Chapter 52, The Last Honest Thing. Time skip common room, a few weeks later. Dear. James's POV. The air in the Gryffindor common room felt thick, stagnant with the things the Marauders no longer said to one another. James sat on the edge of a sofa, his eyes drifting toward the corner where Hayley usually held court with her fifth-year friends. Her chair was empty, her bag gone, which was odd, considering she usually stayed up late to avoid the quiet of the dorms. He turned his gaze to Remus. The tall, thin boy was packing near the portrait hole, his fingernails digging into his palms. The camaraderie that once made these nights feel like a grand adventure had frayed, replaced by a cautious, walking on eggshells silence. James stood up, his movements stiff. He walked toward Remus, but as he reached out, his hand hovered inches from Remus's shoulder. He froze for a second, the weight of a dozen unspoken arguments and distant looks flashing between them. Finally, he let his hand drop onto the worn fabric of Remus's sweater. "If you want," James began, his voice slightly raspy. He swallowed the pride that had been causing so much friction lately. "I'll come with you." Remus stopped packing. He didn't look at James immediately. He looked at the hand on his shoulder as if surprised it was still there. Finally, he met James's eyes and gave a slow, somber nod. Time skip, the Forbidden Forest. Transformation was the only thing that felt honest anymore. As Prongs, James didn't have to worry about the right words or the growing distance between his friends. He was a sixth-year stag, powerful and sleek, his antlers heavy with the maturity of his 17 years. He ran ahead of Remus, his hooves muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. The forest was his kingdom, but tonight, the air felt charged. He burst into a small, moonlit clearing and skidded to a halt, his powerful chest heaving. There, in the center of the light, was a red fox. It was small, barely a year old by the look of it, and it was staring at him with an expression that was hauntingly unanimal. Most foxes would have bolted the moment a stag of his size appeared, but this one remained frozen. Its amber eyes were wide, fixed on his, and it looked, for lack of a better word, absolutely caught. It was a shit look if James had ever seen one. Prongs snorted, a plume of silver mist escaping his nose. He tilted his majestic head, his ears twitching. He felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the creature, a protective instinct that felt sharper than usual. The silence of the clearing was shattered by a sound that made the hair along Prongs's spine stand straight up. A low, wet growl emerged from the darkness behind him. Moony stepped into the light. The werewolf was a jagged shadow of the boy James had just spoken to in the common room. He was lean, hungry, and entirely devoid of human mercy. His yellow eyes locked onto the fox, and he lowered his head, his shoulders bunching as he prepared to snap the small creature's neck. Despite the tension between him and Remus, the big brother instinct in James, the one that had been searching for Hayley in the common room, surged to the surface. Prongs didn't retreat. He stepped forward, his massive body eclipsing the fox. He planted his hooves and lowered his antlers, creating a wall of bone between the predator and the prey. Moony snarled, snapping his jaws just inches from Prongs's neck, his hot breath smelling of copper and wildness. Prongs didn't flinch. He let out a sharp, booming huff, a sound of pure authority staring the wolf down. "Not this fox, Remus, back off." Time skip, the Forbidden Forest. Mage female. Hayley's POV. Hayley's heart was a frantic bird, trapped in a cage of ribs. As a fifth year, she'd been so proud of herself for mastering the Animagus transformation in secret, thinking she was finally catching up to her brother's legendary status. Now, she felt like a complete idiot. She stared up at the stag. He was massive, his coat shimmering like polished mahogany in the moonlight. He looked down at her, with an intelligence that made her fur crawl. James, she thought, though she had no way of knowing for sure it was him. Please don't step on me. Please just keep walking. She didn't dare move. She knew that in the wild, movement triggered the hunt. She just sat there, her tail curled tight around her paws, her fox senses screaming that she was in way over her head. Hayley tucked her head low, certain she was about to feel the crunch of the werewolf's teeth. The growling was deafening, a sound of pure, unadulterated nightmare. But then, the world went dark. Not the darkness of death, but the darkness of a shadow. She looked up through the stag's spindly legs. He was standing directly over her, his body acting as a living shield. The werewolf was right there, as she could see its claws digging into the dirt, but the stag wouldn't move. He stood his ground with a stubbornness that felt so familiar it made her heart ache. The stag let out another forceful blow of air, a command that seemed to vibrate through the very ground Hayley was sitting on. Slowly, the werewolf's growl turned into a frustrated whine. The beast paced for a moment, then turned and loped off into the trees. The stag remained still for a long time, his heavy breathing the only sound in the clearing. Then he lowered his head and gave Hayley's fox ear a tiny, firm nudge with his wet nose. It wasn't an attack, it was a dismissal. He was telling her to go home while she still could. Chapter 53. Ghosts of the Future Time skip the common room the next day. Hayley's quills scratched rhythmically against her parchment, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain as she focused on her transfiguration essay. The usual hum of the common room, the crackle of the hearth, and the distant murmur of chatter felt grounded and steady. Then the air shifted. It didn't snap, it stretched. A faint, rhythmic thrumming began at the base of her skull, the unmistakable vibration of her magic surging without an invitation. She blinked, and for a moment, the world blurred like a watercolor left in the rain. When the colors bled back into focus, the room was still the Gryffindor common room, but the soul of it had changed. The tapestries looked newer, the velvet of the armchairs less worn, and the students. They were strangers. Their robes were cut differently, and the faces were ones she had only seen in flickering, old photographs or heard of in hushed legends. Hayley's breath hitched. She pushed back from her table, her chair making no sound against the floorboards as she stood. She reached out to touch the edge of a nearby desk, but her hand passed through the wood like a trick of the light. She was a ghost in a living memory. Laughter, sharp and familiar in its cadence, drifted from the fireside. Hayley turned slowly. There, huddled together on the worn scarlet sofa, were three figures that seemed to anchor the very air around them. On the left, a boy with bright red hair was gesturing animatedly with a half-eaten sugar quill. On the right, a girl with a magnificent mane of bushy brown hair was buried behind a towering stack of library books, her brow furrowed in concentration. But it was the boy in the middle who made Hayley's heart stop. He sat with a slumped, casual grace, his black hair a chaotic mess that defied both gravity and combs. He laughed at something the ginger boy said, a sound that felt echoes deep in Hayley's chest. Suddenly, the boy in the middle paused. He tilted his head, his green eyes hidden behind round, taped glasses scanning the room as if he'd felt a sudden draft. He turned his gaze directly toward the space where Hayley stood. Hayley froze, her pulse hammering. For a terrifying, beautiful second, she thought he could see her. She looked into his face and saw the ghost of her own features reflected back across decades. She saw James. The connection was a physical pull, a tether of blood and magic that grew so tight it felt like it might snap. The boy frowned, squinting at the seemingly empty air near the portrait hole, before the girl beside him pulled his attention back to a map spread across their laps. The world shuddered. The vibrant colors of the past washed out into a dull gray before snapping back into the warm, familiar tones of the present. Hayley. The voice was grounded and heavy. Hayley gasped, her lungs burning as if she'd been underwater. She was back at her desk. The ink on her parchment was still wet. James was standing a few feet away, his brow knitted in deep concern. He moved toward her, his hand reaching out as if to steady her. "Hayley, you okay? You just went completely white. You looked like you were seeing a ghost." Hayley felt the prickle of sweat on her neck and the fatting hum of her magic. She looked at him, and she really looked at him, comparing the boy from the couch to the boy standing before her. The resemblance was an ache she wasn't ready to name. She forced a small, shaky smile and shrugged, pulling her parchment closer to hide the tremor in her hands. "It's nothing," she said quickly, her voice barely a whisper. "Just caught a headache from the Transfiguration reading. I'm fine."